Although the example that Şems gives of dervishes in a boasting contest is a ridiculous one, it nevertheless provides him with an opportunity to imply that there are others like Bayazid who are different from the foolish pair depicted here. One may conclude from this that Şems considered the sayings of Bayazid to be serious and important consequences of a spiritual state, but at the same time he was concerned about how these words can be misinterpreted and become a veil. His concluding remarks in this passage quote an excerpt from the famous poem by Hallaj, arguing it could be the source of an antinomian interpretation by those who consider themselves to be spirituals, ruhaniyan. But there's something else hidden in the criticism of Bayazid by Şems. The fact is that Bayazid held a singular position as the preeminent early Sufi known for Şafi'iyat. From an early date, Sufis who were contemporary with Bayazid engaged in boasting contests with him in the form of their own ecstatic expressions. Abu Bakr al-Wasiti said, "They all died in delusion up to Bayazid, and he also died in delusion." Likewise, Shibli said, "If Abu Yazid were here, he could become a Muslim with the aid of my children." At a later date, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi also engaged in extensive interpretation of the sayings of Bayazid, including both praise of Bayazid and a subtle kind of one-upmanship to indicate his own superiority. Ibn Arabi called the sayings of Bayazid boasting, fakhr. But he maintained that his own statements about his own spiritual status were not boasting because they were commanded by God. So he made the boast that he made no boast. Subsequently, Sufi thinkers such as Ahmad Sirhindi engaged in the same kind of rhetoric of transcendental hyperbole to claim a spiritual state that went beyond both Bayazid and Ibn Arabi. So from this point of view, dramatic criticism of Bayazid in the form of Shat is perfectly compatible with the recognition of his spiritual eminence. Indeed, such a spiritual critique in the form of a boasting contest can only be justified in relation to a spiritual master of a very high degree. Şems-i Tabrizi, in other remarks, actually insists that Bayazid must be recognized as a saint of the highest status. Thus, he maintains that even if the famous theologian Fakhr Razi were multiplied 100,000 times, he would not come close to the path of Bayazid. Şems repeatedly cites examples of Bayazid's spiritual attainments, including his ability to perceive the true condition of inhabitants of the graveyard, and he refers to Bayazid's selfless actions, such as exchanging the merit of 17 pilgrimages to Mecca in order to give water to a dog, and performing pilgrimage by circumambulating his sheikh 7 times. Yet, in other observations, Şems is willing to make theatrical denunciations, not only of the supposedly intoxicated Bayazid, but even of his sober counterpart, Junayd. Thus, Şems says, "They all speak about Junayd and Bayazid. Let me say Junayd and Bayazid, and their words are cold upon the heart and appear cool." And in the same breath, he can say, "That discussion occurred yesterday. What place do Bayazid and Junayd have here? And that Hallaj, who was also the shame of his master, has fallen, and it has wiped him out. They are not even one hair on the body of the prophet." Şems portrays Bayazid as giving a pretentious speech in a mosque only to be silenced by a woman who denounces him for making a false claim. In this way, Şems concludes, Bayazid cannot endure my presence for 5 days, 1 day, or none. There's no question that Şems-i Tabrizi was deeply devoted to following the example of the prophet in a profound manner, and that did lead Şems to find fault with Bayazid Bistami for claiming a spiritual status that seemed to infringe upon the supremacy of the Prophet Muhammad. Yet the attitude of Şems towards Bayazid was complicated by the rhetoric of boasting that forms part of the tradition of Şafi'iyat or ecstatic expressions. In this respect, Şems also made boasts himself in the form of criticisms that included not only Bayazid, but also the scrupulous and sober Junayd. The audacity of Şems-i Tabrizi was born of the heat of his spiritual experience, in comparison to which the words of previous mystics were simply cold texts. In short, the audacity of Bayazid Bistami was outmatched by the sayings that demonstrate the audacity of Şems-i Tabrizi.